The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of Bagram Airfield like a blade through silk. Captain Nix, Raven Kowalski, froze mid-step on the tarmac, her flight suit still damp with sweat from the pre-flight inspection she'd just completed on her A-10 Thunderbolt II. The voice bleeding through the comm system wasn't supposed to be there. Not on this frequency. Not with that level of desperation threading through every syllable. Broken arrow, grid 41 SUD 23,847 19,381. Immediate CAS required. 12 packs surrounded, danger close. Request immediate. The transmission died in a wash of electronic snow. Raven's hand instinctively moved to her throat mic, but she stopped herself. Protocol dictated that she wait for official tasking through proper channels. The Air Operations Center would coordinate any close air support missions. SEALs didn't just broadcast in the clear on maintenance frequencies. This had to be equipment malfunction, atmospheric interference, maybe even enemy deception. But something in that voice, raw, unfiltered terror barely held in check, made her pause. In 6 years of flying combat missions over Afghanistan, she'd heard fear in many forms. This wasn't panic. This was the sound of someone watching teammates die. The maintenance chief, Senior Airman Rodriguez, appeared beside her aircraft with a puzzled expression. "Captain, you hear that transmission?" sounded like. "I heard it." Raven's gray eyes swept across the flight line, taking inventory. 2 F-16s sat cold on the ramp, their pilots probably still in crew rest. The duty officer was likely buried in paperwork 3 buildings away. Standard response time for unplanned CAS would be 45 minutes minimum, assuming anyone else had monitored that broken transmission. She thought about the grid coordinates. Kunar Province, the valley where angels went to die, as the infantry called it. Steep ridgelines, limited ingress routes, and enough Taliban positions to turn any aircraft into an aluminum cloud. The kind of place where heroes were made and forgotten in the same breath. Rodriguez was still talking, something about maintenance schedules and fuel loads, but his words seemed to come from underwater. Raven found herself staring at her A-10, its titanium bathtub cockpit gleaming dully under the runway lights. The aircraft looked pregnant with ordnance, Maverick missiles, a full load of 13 depleted uranium rounds, enough firepower to level a city block. All dressed up with nowhere to go, as her grandfather used to say about his P-51 Mustang during World War II. The radio crackled again, weaker this time. Any station, American forces in contact, need immediate." Then silence. Not the silence of equipment failure, but the deeper silence of transmission deliberately cut short. Someone had either been overrun or gone to ground, trying to avoid detection while their world collapsed around them. Raven's hand moved to her helmet. The thing about being underestimated was that people never saw you coming until it was too late. Captain Nix Kowalski had spent most of her military career being dismissed as that female pilot who thinks she can fly the Warthog. The A-10 Thunderbolt II wasn't supposed to be a woman's aircraft, according to the old guard. It was a flying tank, a gun with wings, designed for pilots who could handle the physical demands of low-level combat flying and the psychological weight of danger-close fire missions. What they didn't understand was that Nix had been handling weight her entire life. Growing up in rural Montana as the daughter of a single mother who worked 3 jobs, she'd learned to shoulder responsibility before most kids learned to tie their shoes. The name Nix came from her grandmother's obsession with Greek mythology, the primordial goddess of night, older and more powerful than Zeus himself. Her call sign, Raven, had emerged during flight school, when an instructor mockingly suggested that her dark hair and tendency toward silence made her look like Edgar Allan Poe's bird. The name stuck, but not for the reasons he'd intended. She'd embraced it, the way ravens embrace their role as harbingers and protectors. misunderstood creatures of intelligence and fierce loyalty. The unauthorized transmission from Kunar province replayed in her mind as she stood beside her aircraft. 12 American servicemen, probably a special operations team based on the professional calm in that terrified voice. Surrounded, calling for close air support that might never come through official channels fast enough to matter. Rodriguez was updating her on fuel quantities, full internal tanks, external pylons loaded for bear. Her A-10 could loiter over a target area for hours, providing the kind of persistent fires that turned desperate last stands into tactical victories. But taking off without official orders would end her career faster than enemy fire ever could. She thought about her grandfather again, Staff Sergeant Marcus Kowalski, who'd flown bomber escort missions over Germany when the Luftwaffe still had teeth. He'd told her stories about pilots who broke formation to protect stragglers, who ignored orders to save lives, who understood that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting the consequences later. "You know what separated the pilots who came home from the ones who didn't?" he'd asked her once, his weathered hands tracing the outline of his old squadron patch. It wasn't skill, though that mattered. It wasn't luck, though that mattered too. It was knowing when the book didn't apply anymore, when you had to write your own rules in bullets and prayers. The radio remained silent. Somewhere in the Hindu Kush, American warriors were fighting for their lives while bureaucracy moved at the speed of caution. Nix began her walk-around inspection, checking weapons systems with practiced efficiency. The pre-flight inspection revealed what she already knew. Her A-10 was a mechanical symphony of destruction, every system green and ready for violence. The General Electric GAU-8 Avenger cannon nestled in the aircraft's nose like a sleeping dragon, its 7 rotating barrels capable of spitting 3,900 rounds per minute of 30 depleted uranium death. 4 AGM-65 Maverick missiles hung from the wing pylons like steel fruit, each one guided by television sensors and armed with 125-pound shaped charges designed to turn armored vehicles into scrap metal and memories. But it was the aircraft itself that commanded respect, not sleek like the fighters, not fast like the bombers, but purpose-built for the kind of close-quarters aerial combat that separated warriors from pilots. The A-10 had been designed around its gun, an aircraft wrapped around a weapon rather than the other way around. Its twin engines were mounted high and aft to avoid ground fire, its cockpit encased in a titanium bathtub that could stop 23 rounds, its control systems redundant enough to fly home with half its parts missing. It was an ugly aircraft, according to the fighter pilots. They called it the Warthog with sneering affection, the way beautiful people talked about their plain but reliable friends. What they didn't understand was that beauty in combat wasn't about aesthetics. It was about function, about being exactly what the situation demanded when everything else had failed. Nix had logged 847 combat hours in the A-10, more than any other pilot in her squadron. She provided close air support for Marines in Fallujah, covered Army Rangers in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, and saved more ground troops than the Air Force cared to publicize. Her reputation among the infantry was solid gold. When Raven was overhead, you were going home alive. The flight operations officer, Major Chen, emerged from the operations building with a coffee cup and a skeptical expression. He'd been expecting her to prep for a routine combat air patrol, not standing beside a fully armed aircraft at 4 in the morning, with the intensity of someone about to break several federal laws. "Kowalski, you're not scheduled to fly for another 3 hours. What's the story?" She met his gaze without blinking. "Possible troops in contact, sir. Grid coordinates place them in Kunar province, requesting immediate CAS. I monitored the transmission on maintenance frequency." Chen's expression shifted from skeptical to annoyed. "That's not how this works, Captain. You know the procedure. All missions get routed through the AOC, Threat Assessment, Deconfliction." "How long, sir?" What? How long for the full process? Emergency CAS request, threat assessment, mission planning, aircraft assignment, and wheels up. He knew the answer, and she knew he knew it. In perfect conditions, with all systems functioning and full staffing, they might get an aircraft airborne in 30 minutes, more likely 45. But at 4 in the morning, with skeleton crews and cold aircraft, it could be over an hour before help arrived in Kunar province. That's not the point, Kowalski. But it was exactly the point, and they both understood it. The radio transmission had stopped, which meant those 12 Americans were either dead, captured, or hiding in whatever cover they could find while enemy forces closed in around them. Every minute of proper procedure was another minute for the Taliban to position themselves, to call in reinforcements, to transform a rescue mission into a recovery operation. Nix pulled on her helmet, the familiar weight settling over her shoulders like armor. The thing about following orders was knowing which ones mattered, and which ones were just paper barriers between warriors and the work they'd sworn to do. Major Chen was a good officer, a by-the-book administrator who understood that military discipline was built on the foundation of following proper procedures. But he'd never had someone's life depend on his willingness to bend those procedures until they snapped. "Sir, I'm requesting immediate authorization for a combat air patrol over Grid 41S, UD 23,840, 19,381. Single aircraft, minimum loiter time 2 hours, weapons free for defensive purposes only." It was bureaucratic camouflage, a way to frame an unauthorized rescue mission as a routine patrol that just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Chen wasn't stupid. He recognized the verbal jiu-jitsu for what it was, but it gave him plausible deniability if things went sideways. He sipped his coffee, watching her with the expression of a man calculating career risks against moral imperatives. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope, balanced on the edge of regulation and responsibility. "Defensive purposes only," he repeated slowly. "Yes, sir, unless directly threatened or specifically requested by ground forces in contact." Another sip of coffee, another calculation. Chen had 2 combat tours under his belt, enough trigger time to understand the difference between peacetime procedures and wartime realities. He'd probably been in similar situations himself, moments when the right thing and the regulation thing were heading in opposite directions at high speed. "Your fuel load." "Full internal, 2 hours minimum loiter time over target area." "Weapons." "Standard CAS package, Maverick's full gun defensive countermeasures." He nodded slowly, then turned toward the operations building. "I'll notify the AOC of your patrol route after you're airborne. Radio check every 15 minutes, and Kowalski." He paused at the door. "Fly safe." It wasn't authorization exactly, but it wasn't prohibition either. In the gray areas where military operations lived and died, sometimes that was enough. Nix climbed into her cockpit as the first pale fingers of dawn began reaching across the Afghan mountains. The A-10's cockpit wrapped around her like a second skin, every switch and display positioned exactly where 6 years of combat flying had trained her hands to expect them. She'd modified the seat position and control settings until the aircraft responded to her thoughts as much as her touch. Man and machine blended into something more dangerous than either could achieve alone. The engine start sequence was a ritual of precision and power, fuel pumps, generators, hydraulic systems coming online in carefully orchestrated harmony. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines wound up to a throaty whistle, their 9,065 pounds of thrust enough to lift the heavily laden aircraft off the runway and into the thin mountain air. Not fast by fighter standards, not high by bomber standards, but perfect for the low-altitude, high-threat environment where the A-10 earned its reputation. Pre-flight checks flowed like a river of muscle memory. "Flight controls, check. weapons systems, armed navigation, GPS coordinates locked, communication, frequency set to the emergency channel where that desperate voice had called for help. She'd memorized the grid coordinates. 41 SUD 23,840, 19,381. A spot in the Kunar Valley where American forces were fighting for their lives, while the bureaucratic machine slowly ground toward a response. Bagram Tower cleared her for takeoff with the professional indifference of controllers who'd launched thousands of combat sorties. They didn't know she was flying into an unauthorized mission. As far as their records showed, this was just another combat air patrol, routine as morning coffee. They accelerated down the runway with the purposeful determination of a hunting cat, wheels lifting off at 120 knots as the aircraft transitioned from earthbound machine to instrument of aerial warfare. The Afghan landscape unfolded below her, brown mountains and green valleys, villages scattered like dice across terrain that had swallowed armies for centuries. Somewhere ahead, in a valley she'd never seen but somehow knew intimately, American warriors were waiting for salvation that might never come. She banked southeast toward Kunar province, throttles forward, the twin engines pushing her toward a rendezvous with destiny. The radio remained silent, but silence in combat operations usually meant someone was trying very hard not to be found. She just had to hope she wasn't too late to matter. Behind her, Bagram Airfield fell away into the morning haze, taking with it any chance of turning back from whatever was waiting in the mountains ahead. The flight to Kunar province took 23 minutes at 350 knots, the A-10 boring through morning air that tasted of dust and possibility. Nix flew low enough to feel connected to the terrain, high enough to avoid small arms fire, threading the needle between visibility and vulnerability that defined close air support operations. The Hindu Kush mountains rose around her like the spine of some sleeping dragon, their peaks catching the first golden light of dawn, while the valleys remained wrapped in shadow. She'd studied this area during mission planning for other operations, a region where geography and politics conspired to create perfect conditions for asymmetric warfare. Narrow valleys with limited escape routes, high ridgelines that provided commanding fields of fire, and local populations who'd been fighting foreign armies since Alexander the Great decided Afghanistan looked conquerable. The terrain favored defenders who knew every rock and ravine, who could disappear into spider holes and mountain caves, while conventional forces struggled with supply lines and air support that couldn't always distinguish friend from foe. The GPS coordinates led her to a valley that looked like God's own kill zone, steep walls rising 2,000 feet on both sides, a single road threading through the bottom like a target gallery, and enough dead space to hide a regiment of Taliban fighters. It was the kind of place where helicopter pilots woke up in cold sweats, where convoy commanders said their prayers before entering, where close air support became the difference between going home and becoming a casualty statistic. She established a holding pattern at 12,000 feet, high enough to avoid most ground fire but low enough to provide effective close air support when someone called for help. The Maverick missiles and 30mm cannon might not look like much compared to the bomb loads carried by strategic aircraft, but in the knife-fight distances of close air support, they were exactly the right tools for the job. Her radio crackled with the routine chatter of military aviation, helicopter pilots coordinating medical evacuations, transport aircraft requesting landing clearances, fighter jets conducting combat air patrols over other sectors. Normal sounds of a war that had become so routine it felt like background noise, until you remembered that each transmission represented someone's son or daughter risking their life in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. She keyed her microphone to the emergency frequency. Any station vicinity grid 41 S UD 23,840, 19,381. This is Raven 01 with immediate CAS available. Over. Silence. then so faint she almost missed it. Raven 01, this is Viper 6. Authenticate Delta Lima 79er. Authentication codes. Someone was still alive down there, still professional enough to verify her identity before revealing their position. She checked her mission cards. Delta Lima 79er was today's challenge code for Special Operations Forces in the Kunar region. Viper 6, Raven 01 authenticates Whiskey X-Ray 44. I have immediate CAS mixed ordnance 2 hours loiter time. Send your traffic. The voice that came back was steady, professional, and absolutely desperate. Raven, we are 12 packs surrounded vicinity grid 41S, UD 23,840, 719,381. Approximately 40 enemy fighters in prepared positions along ridgelines north and south of our location. We have wounded, limited ammunition. Request immediate fires danger close. How copy? She copied perfectly. 12 special operations soldiers trapped in a valley kill zone, outnumbered 3-1 by enemy fighters in fortified positions, wounded teammates who couldn't be moved, ammunition running low. The kind of tactical nightmare that turned heroes into casualties and victories into tragedies. But they had one advantage their enemies didn't expect. An A-10 Thunderbolt II flown by a pilot who'd spent her entire career being underestimated, who understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people no one expected to win. Nix pushed the throttles forward and began her descent toward the killing ground below. The tactical picture crystallized as she dropped to 8,000 feet, close enough to see muzzle flashes sparking from positions along both ridgelines like deadly fireflies in the morning shadows. The Special Operations Team, 12 American warriors whose names she didn't know but whose courage she recognized, had taken cover behind a cluster of boulders at the valley bottom, returning fire when they could but clearly pin down by superior numbers and positioning. She could see the tactical problem immediately. The enemy had done this before, had probably been setting up this ambush for days or weeks, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. They'd positioned fighting positions to create overlapping fields of fire, established escape routes back into the mountains, and chosen ground that made close air support extremely challenging. Drop ordnance too close to the ridgelines, and you risked bringing down rock slides on the Americans below. Attack from the wrong angle, and you'd fly directly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple positions. It was a chess game played with bullets and blood, where one wrong move would turn a rescue mission into a tragedy that would echo through families and Pentagon briefings for years to come. Raven 01, Viper 6. I can mark our position with IR strobe, but we're taking heavy fire from both ridgelines. Enemy positions are approximately 200 meters north and south of our location, dug in with crew-served weapons. We've got 2 urgent surgical, 1 routine, running low on ammo. How long can you stay on station? 2 urgent surgical meant American warriors bleeding out while she circled overhead calculating angles of attack. The clinical military terminology couldn't disguise the human reality. Someone's son was dying in the dirt, while his teammates tried to keep him alive with pressure dressings and prayers. Viper 6, I can give you 2 hours minimum mixed ordnance including danger close capabilities. Recommend you mark friendly positions and stay low. I'm going to make a show of force pass first, see if we can get them to reveal additional positions. Show of force, military euphemism for flying low and loud enough to remind the enemy that American air power was overhead, watching, ready to rain death from above. Sometimes that was enough to break enemy morale and send them running for the caves. Sometimes it just made them angry and more determined to kill Americans before the situation deteriorated further. She banked into a steep dive toward the valley floor, the A-10's twin engines howling as she accelerated past 400 knots in a low-level pass designed to rattle windows and nerves. The aircraft shuddered as she pulled out at 500 feet above ground level, climbing back toward attack altitude while her eyes cataloged enemy positions revealed by muzzle flashes, and the instinctive human tendency to duck when several tons of military aircraft screamed overhead at treetop level. The radio exploded with chatter. "Raven, they're moving. I count at least 6 positions on the north ridge, maybe 8 on the south side. They've got RPGs, at least 1 heavy machine gun, and they're not running." Professional soldiers, then, not militia fighters who would scatter at the first sign of air power. This was going to require precision, patience, and the kind of violent expertise that separated close air support pilots from everyone else who wore wings. Nix began planning her attack runs, calculating angles and distances, while the radio crackled with updates from the valley below. The first attack run required the kind of precision that separated legends from casualties. Nix rolled into a 30-degree dive toward the northern ridgeline, where muzzle flashes marked at least 6 enemy positions dug into the rocky terrain like deadly flowers blooming in stone gardens. The A-10's targeting systems painted the threat positions with electronic precision, while her eyes confirmed what the sensors detected: crew-served weapons, RPG teams, and enough small arms fire to turn the valley into a shooting gallery. "Viper 6, Raven inbound North Ridge, danger close. Keep your heads down." The Maverick missile separated from its pylon with a gentle thump, its television seeker head locked onto the largest heat signature among the enemy positions. She watched through the targeting display as the missile tracked toward impact, 125 pounds of high explosive and shaped charge designed to eliminate hardened targets with surgical precision. The explosion bloomed orange and black against the mountainside, sending rocks and debris cascading into the valley, while secondary explosions suggested they'd hit an ammunition cache or weapons stockpile. But the return fire didn't slacken. If anything, it intensified, muzzle flashes sparking from positions she hadn't previously identified. The enemy had learned from experience, had probably faced American air power before and understood that survival meant dispersal, concealment, and the willingness to accept casualties while inflicting maximum damage on American forces. Good hit, good hit. Enemy position destroyed, but we're still taking fire from multiple locations. They're moving between positions, hard to get a count. She banked hard left, pulling GS that pressed her deeper into the ejection seat while setting up for a gun run on the southern ridgeline. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon was the A-10's primary weapon, a hydraulically driven Gatling gun that could fire 30 depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute. Each round was the size of a beer bottle, traveling at 3,500 feet per second, capable of penetrating tank armor at 2 miles distance. Against personnel targets in prepared positions, it was absolute destruction delivered with mechanical precision. The cannon run required flying directly toward the enemy positions, accepting their return fire while maintaining steady aim long enough to deliver effective fires. It was a game of aerial chicken played with automatic weapons and surface-to-air missiles, where hesitation meant mission failure and overconfidence meant becoming a smoking crater in the mountains of Afghanistan. She lined up on a cluster of muzzle flashes, squeezed the trigger, and watched the mountain explode in dust and fire as 65 rounds of 30 death carved through rock and flesh with equal efficiency. Holy shit, Raven. Direct hit on enemy position, multiple KIA visible. You just saved our ass. But the celebration was premature. As she pulled off target, climbing back toward attack altitude, her threat warning system lit up with the electronic signature of surface-to-air missiles tracking her aircraft. Someone down there had been waiting for exactly this moment, when the A-10 was predictable and vulnerable, committed to its attack run and unable to maneuver freely. The missile launch warning filled her headset with urgent electronic tones while her hands moved automatically to defensive systems, chaff and flare dispensers, electronic countermeasures, evasive maneuvers that would test the A-10's structural limits, and her own tolerance for gravitational punishment. The first missile passed close enough to rattle her teeth, its proximity fuse detonating in a cloud of shrapnel that peppered the A-10's armored hide without penetrating the titanium bathtub that protected her cockpit. The second missile was tracking better, its seeker head locked onto her engine heat signature, closing the distance with mathematical precision, while she tried every defensive measure in the book. She rolled inverted and pulled toward the Earth, using terrain masking to break the missile's lock, while praying the A-10's legendary durability would prove equal to whatever punishment was coming. The missile detonated against the mountainside, close enough to shake the aircraft but far enough away to avoid catastrophic damage. Her engine instruments remained green, flight controls still responsive, weapons systems still online. The A-10 had taken a beating and was still flying, still fighting, still capable of delivering the kind of close air support that would determine whether 12 American warriors went home alive or became another casualty statistic in a war most Americans had forgotten was still being fought. "Raven, you okay up there? We saw the missile launch, saw the explosions." She keyed the microphone. "Viper 6, Raven is still mission capable. I'm going to need better target identification for the next run. These guys are professionals, and they're not going to make the same mistakes twice." The tactical situation was evolving into something more dangerous than a simple troops in contact scenario. The enemy force was larger, better equipped, and more tactically sophisticated than initial reports had suggested. They had surface-to-air missiles, crew-served weapons, prepared positions, and the kind of fire discipline that suggested professional military training rather than militia enthusiasm. Which meant this wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a pitched battle between American Special Operations Forces and what was probably a Taliban elite unit, fought in terrain that favored the defenders and with stakes that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. If 12 American Special Operations soldiers died in this valley, the strategic implications would reverberate through Pentagon briefings and congressional hearings for months. But more immediately, there were still American warriors bleeding in the dirt below, still counting ammunition and watching the sky for salvation that wore the wings of the United States Air Force. Nix began planning her next attack run, this time with the kind of tactical patience that separated survivors from heroes. The second phase of the engagement required a different approach, less sledgehammer, more scalpel. The enemy had revealed their defensive capabilities and tactical sophistication. Now it was time to exploit their weaknesses with the kind of precision flying that turned aircraft into surgical instruments of warfare. Nix established a figure-8 holding pattern at 10,000 feet, using her targeting systems to map enemy positions with methodical care. The A-10 sensors could distinguish between active firing positions and abandoned fighting holes, between crew-served weapons and individual riflemen, between targets worth a Maverick missile and targets that required the personal attention of 30 depleted uranium rounds. "Viper 6, I need detailed target information. Talk me onto specific threats in order of priority." The voice from the valley floor was strained but professional. "Raven, highest priority is heavy machine gun position on South Ridge, approximately 150 meters southeast of our location. They have direct fire on our casualties, and we can't move them until that position is neutralized." She found it through her targeting optics. A dug-in position with overhead cover, muzzle flashes indicating a crew-served weapon of significant caliber, probably a Soviet-era D-SHK heavy machine gun, capable of engaging both ground targets and low-flying aircraft. The position was well-sighted, well-protected, and manned by gunners who understood the tactical value of sustained suppressive fire. It was also positioned close enough to the American forces that any missile attack risked fratricide from blast effects or secondary fragments. This required the GAU-A-10 cannon, delivered with the kind of precision that left no room for error or hesitation. She rolled into her attack run from the northwest, approaching the target from an angle that would minimize collateral damage while maximizing terminal effects on target. The cannon sight picture developed as she descended, crosshairs centered on the enemy position, range decreasing through optimal firing parameters, trigger finger applying steady pressure while the aircraft shuddered under recoil forces that would tear apart a lesser airframe. 68 rounds of 30 fire impacted the mountainside in a concentrated burst that lasted less than 3 seconds but delivered more kinetic energy than a freight train collision. The enemy machine gun position simply ceased to exist, transformed from tactical threat to smoking crater in the span of a heartbeat. Outstanding. Direct hit on the heavy machine gun. Target destroyed. We can move our casualties now. But even as she pulled off target, climbing back toward attack altitude, the radio brought news that transformed tactical success into strategic complexity. Raven, be advised we have movement in the valley to the east. Looks like reinforcements, approximately 20 additional personnel with vehicles moving toward our location. 20 more enemy fighters meant the tactical balance was shifting from difficult to impossible. 40-plus enemy combatants in prepared positions with crew-served weapons, surface-to-air missiles, and now vehicular mobility, against 12 American Special Operations soldiers with limited ammunition and wounded teammates who couldn't maneuver effectively. The mathematics of small unit tactics were unforgiving. Without immediate and decisive air support, this engagement was going to end badly for the Americans. But mathematics didn't account for the A-10 Thunderbolt II, for pilots trained to turn impossible odds into tactical victories, or for the kind of professional determination that separated warriors from casualties in the crucible of combat operations. Nix checked her weapons inventory. 3 Maverick missiles remaining, 800 rounds of 30 ammunition, and enough fuel for 90 minutes of additional combat operations. Not enough to fight a conventional battle against superior numbers, but potentially sufficient for the kind of asymmetric warfare that turned individual aircraft into force multipliers. She keyed her microphone. Viper 6, I'm going to interdict those reinforcements before they can reach your position. Maintain defensive posture and be prepared to move on my command. The eastern valley stretched below her like a tactical corridor, the perfect terrain for an interdiction mission that would demonstrate why close air support had become the infantry's best friend and the enemy's worst nightmare. The interdiction run required split-second timing and absolute precision. Nix could see the enemy reinforcement convoy threading through the eastern valley, 3 vehicles moving at tactical speed, probably carrying additional fighters and crew-served weapons, intended to tip the balance decisively against the trapped American forces. She had one opportunity to destroy the convoy before it reached positions where the enemy could establish interlocking fields of fire that would make any rescue impossible. Miss this shot, and 12 American Special Operations soldiers would face odds that no amount of courage could overcome. The lead vehicle was a pickup truck mounted with what appeared to be a recoilless rifle, capable of engaging both ground targets and low-flying aircraft. The second vehicle looked like a troop transport, probably carrying 8 to 10 fighters armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The third vehicle was harder to identify through her targeting optics, but its antenna array suggested a command and control function, possibly coordinating the entire enemy operation. She selected her remaining Maverick missiles for the attack, programming them for different target priorities. The first missile would engage the lead vehicle, eliminating the crew-served weapon that posed the greatest threat to American forces. The second missile would target the troop transport, reducing enemy manpower before additional fighters could deploy into prepared positions. The third missile would eliminate the command vehicle, disrupting enemy coordination and communications. Viper 6, Raven engaging enemy reinforcements. Danger close may apply to your location due to blast effects. Stay low and maintain cover. She rolled into a shallow dive that would allow multiple missile engagements while maintaining sufficient altitude to avoid concentrated ground fire. The first Maverick separated from its pylon with mechanical precision, its television seeker head tracking toward the lead technical with computer-guided determination. The explosion lifted the vehicle several feet off the ground before dropping it back to Earth as burning scrap metal and human remains. The second missile engaged the troop transport with equally devastating results, 125 pounds of high explosive detonating against the vehicle's side armor, transforming transportation into cremation in a single brilliant flash. Any fighters who survived the initial blast would be in no condition to continue offensive operations. But the third missile malfunctioned, its seeker head failing to acquire the command vehicle before the weapon impacted harmlessly against the mountainside. The command and control element remained operational, still coordinating enemy activities, still capable of calling in additional reinforcements or directing complex tactical maneuvers. Which meant the engagement was far from over, despite the successful elimination of immediate reinforcement threats. Raven, outstanding work on those vehicles. We count 2 destroyed, 1 damaged and withdrawing. Enemy fire from the ridgelines has decreased significantly. I think you got their attention. She had indeed gotten their attention, but not necessarily in a good way. Professional military forces didn't abandon tactical operations because of initial setbacks. They adapted, improvised, and continued the mission with whatever resources remained available. The enemy command element was probably calling for additional support, repositioning surviving fighters, and planning countermeasures designed to neutralize American air power. Her threat warning system confirmed those suspicions, detecting additional surface-to-air missile signatures from positions she hadn't previously identified. The enemy was learning, adapting, bringing additional anti-aircraft capabilities online in response to her successful interdiction mission. But learning was a two-way street, and Nix had been studying this particular enemy for the past 30 minutes of combat operations. She understood their tactics, their capabilities, their tendency to mass fires rather than distribute them efficiently. She knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and most importantly, she knew exactly how much punishment the A-10 Thunderbolt II could absorb while still completing its mission. The final phase of the engagement would determine whether 12 American warriors went home alive or became casualties in a war that had already lasted too long and cost too much. She began her approach for the decisive attack run, knowing that everything, mission success, American lives, and her own survival, would be determined in the next few minutes. The decisive engagement began with electronic warnings screaming through her headset as multiple surface-to-air missiles launched simultaneously from concealed positions. The enemy had learned from their earlier failures, had coordinated their anti-aircraft fires to create an overlapping engagement zone that would test every defensive system on the A-10, and every bit of skill Nix had developed during 6 years of combat flying. She rolled into evasive maneuvers while dispensing chaff and flares, the aircraft's defensive systems creating a cloud of electronic and infrared decoys designed to confuse incoming missiles. The first missile detonated against chaff bundles, its radar seeker fooled by metallic strips that mimicked the A-10's electronic signature. The second missile tracked a flare burst, exploding harmlessly against the mountainside while she maneuvered toward terrain masking. But the third missile was tracking true, its seeker head locked onto her engine heat signature with computer.